Let's bring in our foreign affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert, to talk a bit more about those attacks on St. Petersburg today. Doug, hello. This is actually the second time in a month that Ukrainian forces have struck a big Russian city like this. Let's assume this is a deliberate strategy because, like today, that previous one was also ahead of a big event by Vladimir Putin. What message do you think Ukraine is trying to send?
We could strike you when we want, how we want, and we could hit you where it most hurts. There are two sort of prongs here. There's a psychological element, psychological impact, and then there's a purely economic one. So on the economic level, Zelensky has called these long-range drone attacks long-range sanctions, directly referring to the economic aspect. These attacks have, by and large, almost exclusively been targeting oil infrastructure, refineries and terminals, other military sites. That is the facilities, the machines, the equipment used to fuel Vladimir Putin's war machine, the war against Ukraine. By knocking them out, that presumably makes it harder for Vladimir Putin to fuel his war machine, and primarily with oil and oil exports. A lot of that oil produced in Siberia flows through a vast Russian pipeline network. So you knock out either the pipelines or the refineries that refine the oil at the end. A lot of it goes to Western Russia for domestic consumption. Prices have been rising there. A lot of it goes for export over the Black Sea, Baltic Sea, onward and upward, and we've seen the Shadow Fleet this week. We've talked about that. So there's the economic impact, and he knows that he wants to make Russia hurt economically. Its economy is hurting economically, 40% of its budget already going to defense and security. Then psychological. Remember, if you are a Russian, one of the millions of Russians, most of the Russian population, who has gotten one message from this war: there is no war. It's a special military operation. Nothing's happening, nothing to see here, carry on. They've been able to, by and large, live their lives beyond the immediate reminders of this horrible, horrific war being waged in their name. And the state-run propaganda has been very effective. Yes, now and then there have been strikes, even earlier on in the war, and they were given reminders, but it's been kept out of the news, kept out of the state-controlled media. Now you can't help but see it. The billowing plumes of smoke from these attacks rising from oil terminals, from refineries, are posted on social media by Russians driving down the expressway in their cars. You can't help but see it. Petersburg, billowing smoke on the horizon, just as Putin is about to host what is his pride and joy, the marquee event on the Russian calendar after the Victory Day parade in May. This is the Saint Petersburg Economic Forum, which has been sort of the jewel in the crown for Russia to attract investors in past years. Well, not too many investors are coming anymore, at least from the West. I think the guest of honor this year is Saudi Arabia has sent a delegation. But so psychological, hey, the war's here, and Ukraine is basically bringing the war back to the country that started it, to Russia, and it's telling the Russians, wake up, this is what your leadership's doing. They might not be telling you, but we're certainly here to remind you of it.
All right, well, let's talk about Russia's response. We've had the Kremlin today saying that it will, quote, respond in a systematic nature to those strikes on St. Petersburg. Do you think that Putin will be reassessing his approach towards Ukraine in the light of what we've seen?
I could be more categorical than that. I don't think Putin will be reassessing, Nadia. I know Putin will not be reassessing. I know that not because I'm an oracle. I know that because Putin has been very explicit. Putin has been very clear. The so-called maximalist demands that Ukrainian forces have to withdraw from the territory that Russian forces are yet to conquer in the Donetsk region of Donbass. There's still a slither of territory that Ukrainian forces have been battling, I'll use the word valiantly, to hold on to. And Russian forces basically want full capitulation. These are maximalist demands. It's not going to happen. They don't want Ukraine to have an army that's at all viable. They don't want Ukraine to enter into any alliances with anyone outside of Russia's immediate sphere of influence, Putin's sphere of influence. These are no-go conditions. But Putin is not reassessing them. On the contrary, all indications that he gets his information from Gerasimov, who's his sort of, the head of his army forces, all of his forces, and that he's getting a very glossy version of what's going on the battlefield. So he may come by his disinformation honestly because he's been given misinformation and disinformation. But Vladimir Putin has been nothing but clear in the fact that he sees himself as being in a victorious posture. He believes even if right now he might be not making the same gains that he thought he initially would, and he's a little bit on the back foot, eventually he's obviously going to win. That's how he sees it. And he believes the sooner Ukraine capitulates, the better it will be for everyone. This is why the Kremlin's been so desperate to get the U.S. back in the game, back into the negotiation cycle, because he knows once the U.S. is in, Trump presumably has troped towards Putin, has favored Putin in these negotiations, and would ramp up the pressure on Zelensky in Ukraine to settle for a deal. But no, Putin is not reassessing. I don't have any reason to believe that anyone around him is giving a clear version of this war. He does have a few economic advisors saying it's catastrophic economically and we cannot sustain this war economy indefinitely. But Putin is not in that mindset. He's in a mindset that his vision has to win out. He has the winning formula. It's just a matter of time against a weak and decadent West, and especially a weak and decadent Ukraine that is just bound to collapse at some point.
And look, we mustn't forget, Doug, that at the same time as we've seen this visually spectacular attack on St. Petersburg today, there are near daily Russian attacks on Ukraine.
Yeah.
And, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said time and time again, he does not have the anti-defense infrastructure that he needs to keep his country safe.
He does not have enough of the missiles, interceptor missiles, to hit out of the sky the devastatingly accurate and powerful ballistic and hypersonic missiles, not just ballistic, but hypersonic missiles that Russia has been sending, mixing into these cocktails, these barrages night after night of drones and missiles. And this is the problem. That's why he basically wrote to Congress. That's why he appealed to Trump in the U.S. last week, Zelensky, saying, we need your Patriots, because there's nothing more painful than seeing Patriot missile launchers that don't have the missiles in them to shoot down these incoming Russian missiles. So while Ukraine and drone warfare has reshaped the way we view war and reshaped the way that Ukraine wages war and has turned it into a leader in drone technology on the world stage, while that's all true and happening and has changed the equation and enabled Ukraine to hold parity on the battlefield because the Russians can't use these big infantry assaults and mechanized units anymore, it's just too dangerous against drones, while that's all true, you ultimately are very vulnerable when you don't have defenses against these devastating weapons that Ukraine just doesn't have enough of at all. These incoming missiles, these hypersonic missiles, that's going to be a factor going forward. Putin knows it. Putin knows he's not advancing on the battlefield or creeping along, if at all. He knows he's going to continue as much as he can these drone and missile attacks in the hope that at some point the Ukrainians are going to grow weary, throw their hands up and cry uncle and get to the negotiating table.
All right, thank you.